Hi, thanks for joining us on the Rural Social Worker episode 7, Education in Rural Communities. And I have two guests from the Me and Tea podcast, Myles and Elena. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Elena, and I'm a co-host of the Me and Tea podcast, where we spill the tea on social work.
Hey, my name is Myles. I'm the other co-host for the Me and Tea podcast. Yeah, we're both social workers here in the state of Idaho.
So what does it mean by spilling the tea on social work?
That's a good question. So this started as a school project for us, and we do a lot as social workers, and you can cover a lot. And in rural areas specifically, you have to be more versatile. So we started it with maybe exposing some of the struggles of what being in a rural community looks like, what some of the struggles of being a student in the social work program was, especially from varying backgrounds, which Myles and I both have, and then just the resources that people need. Did I miss anything, Myles?
No, I think it was kind of it started out as a project, right? And then it turned into kind of how me and Alina would cope with the struggles of working as a social worker, being in school full time, having families, all the things that is daily life, and having a tough profession in the social work field. So yeah, it's been pretty great.
Awesome. And this also started as a project for me for school. So it will be the second episode that I'm doing post-doctoral program. So it is not part of school, and so we should have fun. I want to talk about, so the goal of my podcast is to talk about rural communities, how they're different, the struggles that exist in those communities that maybe people who have never worked here before or have never lived here before need to know to work in those communities, or people who are coming out of school or looking for social work schools, or mental health in general. So I wanted to talk today with you guys about education and kind of I know you guys went to Northwest Nazarene University and they had their own competency for rural social work. What did that, when they were explaining that to you, what did they explain that to you as when they first introduced it? Do you remember?
I remember, and I'm probably not going to say the exact competency because I don't. But I remember they introduced a lot of our professors were from rural communities in the state of Idaho specifically, and so when they introduced this competency to us, they just talked about what resources and stuff were missing from their communities, and a lot of it, was pretty like vital, basic healthcare needs, mental health care needs, and they kind of introduced it as like if we're going to continue to practice social work in the state of Idaho, whether we're in Boise, which is very populated, or we're on the outskirts and rural areas, that we would need to know some of these, like some of the things that we're missing in other communities, so that we could work towards helping bridge those gaps and closing the gaps between not having services and maybe too many services in one little small pocket and reaching out to other areas of the community.
Okay.
For me, I think that the two main things that I remember was defining what is considered a rural population. And remind me, Dr. Charles, have you covered that on previous episodes of your podcast? What constitutes as a rural, a rural area?
Yeah. In episode 1, we talked about kind of what is rural. The biggest thing to review on that is there is no definition of rural, right? There's frontier, which is really remote, and then rural is such a broad thing. And I think communities can function as a rural community and be more populated, but still function as one. Like where we live, I think it very much functions as a rural community, even though the combined communities are 40,000 people, because of the fact that we are a farming community and we function like a farming community. And so I think, but when you get up above, I think 40, 50,000, then you're less likely to function like that. I don't know. I always joke that there's like core families in this area that just kind of reproduced and then they're still here and their families are still here. And that's what the population is. And so but there is no definition of rural, so it makes it hard. And that's what makes it hard for grants and for education and for all of those things, because every single system that is approving grants or going through education has different stipulations for what is rural.
Yeah, so that's a great point. Like you said, it varies and it's subjective and relative to which community you live in. So while Miles and I both attended the same school, which is located in southern Idaho, we had very different perspectives on what rural really meant. And there were individuals, because we did a combined cohort where it was online combined with in-person classes, there were people from rural areas in southern Idaho, and I'm like, that doesn't count. You have more than one grocery store. Also, like he said, our professors shared what they had faced in their community, because several of them were from rural areas. And the thing that I found most interesting was border towns. How many communities you reached if you were close to a border, because some of our professors were from Oregon and drove to Nampa to teach. And then I know you've shared the location of where you're located at, Dr. Charles, and I obviously work with you. So we're on a border town here between Idaho and Washington, and it takes me 10 minutes to get to our office. And I drive across a bridge of a river, and I'm in a completely different state. And there's different guidelines and some different resources based on state progressiveness and things like that. And so I think that that's really interesting and affects a rural area as well. But it was one of the things that stood out to me the most. Not everybody understands when you say I'm on a border town, and what you bill for one insurance in one community is different than what you bill in another insurance community. And that means you have different resources and different state funds. Like you said, that affects grants and education programs. I was combining those two. And that's really hard sometimes to explain to one client, this is what you can get here, but that's not what you can get across the river. I know, I see it, but there's a difference. And so that's a piece that they touched on briefly, but something I felt we learned more as we progressed in our program, especially considering internships. And when we would come to our internship class and people would talk about the variations there, I just think that that's something that you don't experience in a more metropolis area.
Do you feel like in your program they really talked about the culture that exists in rural communities and really focused on that? Or do you think it was more just a pillar, or a competency that you guys talked about but really didn't like focus a lot on?
I would say there was quite a few discussions on the difference between confidentiality in like a very populated, maybe a bigger city. Like let's take Boise, that it's a ton more people than even maybe where you guys are at. And some of the issues with confidentiality being, if there's only one mental health provider in a rural community, that provider is probably also, friends with the teachers of the one school, or like everyone in the community knows each other. So how, like, the importance of confidentiality with those things are just not things that you would think about in maybe a bigger city when you don't have to worry about running into your clients everywhere you go. Maybe they live on your street, and stuff like that. So we did have a lot of conversation during school about some of those differences and what it would look like, and when there's conflict of interest and treatment, how to navigate that as a provider.
Concerning cultural differences, I think that was one of the things that I loved about our internship class, or maybe any time we came together and we discussed diagnosis or treatment modalities, because up here, I'm close to the Nez Perce Reservation. I grew up on it. I lived on it for many years. Down there, they have Blackfoot Reservation, different religious communities and farming cultures than what is practiced up here, just due to difference of crops. And you wouldn't think that that's a culture that we face, but it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like group conversation is really what drove the education that came out of that, even if we didn't agree. because I feel like what I grew up with, rural northern Idaho, is vastly different than what southern Idaho had. But they felt it was different too. And so it just was a different exposure, I guess is a good way to say it. And so I felt like I learned more from my classmates driving those conversations than I did maybe our professors. Not for lack of their trying, but like they'd open the can of worms and we'd just go in the wormhole. So
Was it offered in any other classes besides your internship? Like, did they offer a rural social work class that really focused on it, or bring pieces into other classes, or was it really just your internship class that had it?
I, be- I believe we did have a rural social work class, but it was an online, wasn't it an online class that we had to
it
take?
was. Oh my gosh. Yes, you're right.
Yeah.
I remember the book. It's yellow and got like trees and
hmm
farmhouses on it. Yes.
Yeah, and I I really wish that one was an in-person one, right? Because we're talking about how so many of these like learning experiences can group discussion. Um, but that one was really just online, reading stuff, writing discussion posts, and kind of
So it
learning
wasn't
it
like
on
a
your.
live online class, like where you had a discussion on Zoom. It was just you read about the class.
Yeah,
Okay.
And
there was a.
and I think that that is different for each student because sure, I can like check a box and get through a class but I mean, this is probably why I picked the specialty I picked. I love relationships. I love human connection. I think we draw so much more when we're with someone else than if we do it by ourselves. So I'm with Myles. That class probably could have been structured differently. The other thing was, I didn't have a ton of wiggle room, and neither did Myles in our program because we did an advanced standing program. So classes were really determined for us. If I'm correct in remembering, we got to pick 2 electives. Was that it, Myles? I know domestic violence was one we took together, and I feel like there was one other one.
Advanced trauma.
Trauma.
hmm
Trauma. And obviously, like, I geared those, this sounds bad, but based on the community I knew I was going to be in and work with. And maybe not knowing the specialty at that time that had chosen me, but it chose me, and I'm glad that I picked those topics because they correlate really well with what I chose for my specialty.
Yeah, and like when I went to, I had a generalist program, so mine wasn't like we didn't have a clinical track or an ability to pick clinical or community um, interventions or anything. So it was very generalist. We had, even though we were taking it in a rural community, we had no. They never talked about rural at all. It was through Boise State University, and they did a distance version. Now, a lot of our providers worked in rural communities because they were local to here, but we still didn't really get to know how to do that because it was more how to work a CBS and how to work for the state and how to do all of that stuff. And I know programs have changed drastically, and most programs do not have MSW programs do not have a rural social work aspect. So it's very rare that your guys' university did. And that's kind of what I want to see. Like, did it help you be more effective when you got out in the community working in a rural? I know, Lena, you work in a rural community. Myles, you work in you work down in Boise, right? Area.
But I will say, in terms of learning, I came from Sacramento, California, which is couldn't be more opposite from rural, right? I mean, like big town, thousands of people everywhere, um, and just like a surplus of resources. So coming to Southern Idaho was actually, like, I say rural because I don't, Elena might end our
A little bit of a
podcast
trigger.
together, but um,
We've had multiple conversations about how he has it better. Like, you
um,
don't understand.
yeah, it is. But coming here in Idaho, right, is very different than, culturally just where I grew up in terms of what resources are available. So I would say even if like you're practicing social work in the state of California, you
Mhm.
probably have really little idea of rural communities unless you study it on your jump into that class. So it is very, it's been a huge learning curve for me, just finding what resources we have, networking with or small towns, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, some of the research that I found when I was doing the research for this podcast was not only was it a struggle in education when you're in your MSW program, but then finding trainings to do things, in your community. Elena and I are going to Seattle next weekend to attend a training. We're flying, it's a 6-hour drive if we want to drive. But finding trainings in this area is hard to find. And so it's not just in education, but it's after you get out of education, and also knowing everybody in the community can be difficult if you have your own therapist in the community, then going to trainings and seeing that therapist in those trainings. And I've had that happen myself. The other thing is that they talked about in the research was how not addressing rural communities in MSW programs contributes to stigma. Do you feel like it reduced your stigma around rural communities by having that aspect?
So I think, again, as soon as Myles said it, I could recall that textbook, and I was like, yeah, I think that probably went to a bookstore somewhere, but maybe I should have kept it. It's also hard because I am here and practicing, but I also geared my research to try to learn more about rural communities. But finding research was hard. And you're right, like finding trainings is hard. And I do think maybe the variety of the background, because this is a good point about education. I'm secluded up here. Like the closest university is 30 to 40 minutes away. We have a state college in Idaho in the town that I live in, but it doesn't have graduate programs. And so trying to find a graduate program so I could expand and actually use my BSW, going to my MSW to do this job was really, really hard. And I had to be very selective about what I wanted and what I wanted to learn. And that's how I ended up at NNU. And I'm blessed for their online program, despite the difficulties of being remote and having to call into classes. Also, like, I don't know why for 16 months, the whole hour difference tripped me up nonstop. So the time zone thing messed me up. Myles would be like, hey, are you enjoying class? And I'm like, oh my God, yes. Yes, I'm on my way. I'm on my way. Um, more than I would care to admit that happened. But I think the diversity that came with their program and their ability to incorporate online people did help expand that rural knowledge. I don't know if that answered your question. I'm sorry.
Well, I just want to kind of know if it helped you, the stigmas that exist in rural communities. One, knowing about the stigmas that exist in them, but reducing that. So, in another podcast that I had a guest on, we talked about how telehealth reduces stigma in rural communities because people can be on telehealth. They don't have to tell anybody that they're doing therapy. They can get therapy outside of the community if needed, and they don't have to worry about running into people. But also, I think it's part of our job as social workers to help reduce that stigma. And if we are not educated about rural communities and how they work, are we doing a good job at doing that?
Well, I think that ties back to what Myles and I consider as difference between rural, right? Like he's right. He came from California and then he was like, "Oh no, this is rural." And I'm like, "No, it's not." um so maybe like I definitely think going through classes there was a stigma between what I considered rural in northern Idaho and what was considered rural in southern Idaho. So I mean, I apparently had my own prejudices and stigmas included. So, in some ways, yeah, it helped bridge the gap in recognizing other people's considerations of what a stigma looks like or what really anything different looked like culture wise and stuff like that.
What about advocating for reducing stigma?
I was gonna say I went to my undergrad in Arizona, which definitely has a lot more rural areas than California. I know California has its fair share of, small towns outside of the big known towns, but um, rural communities were never talked about in undergrad. Um, Never even considered, like my high school, just growing up. I could, I don't know the statement, but I could ignore that rural communities existed, essentially, right, without any knowledge of what that meant. I had my resources, I was just living, and then coming here, um, I had prided myself on advocating for other communities, marginalized populations, stuff like that, and never once considered that rural communities should be a huge part of that advocacy. And I think coming to Idaho gave me like it almost spearheaded that I could do that, if that makes sense. Not that I couldn't in other places, but it's so important to advocate for those communities here. And really, it all
But
started
maybe it
with
didn't
just
occur either.
understanding what those communities are.
Uh-huh.
I
What
also think,
about, oh, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say being, I don't know how else to say this, born into a rural community, you don't know anything else, right?
No.
And you're kind of behind the 8 ball in some ways. Like you have to learn to advocate for yourself, or it's kind of like a sink or swim thing. Like resources, scholarships is a great thing. Like in high school, this sounds really egotistical, but I had more money than the valedictorian because I worked my butt off and I applied to every scholarship in the area, whether I met the qualifications or not. And half the time I just got the money because I was the only one that applied for the scholarship. And that was hard because I was in a 1A school, which is, just to put it in perspective, meant I graduated with 22 people in my graduating class. And it was tiny, and nobody really looked at those little schools unless you made them look. And so I kind of had that advocation piece coming into it. But then this is a whole other ballpark that I had to learn. And I'm like, oh darn. Like, oh, you wanna do an eating disorder program? Great. It's 2 hours away. Like, you want something better for your teens? Great. That's 3 or 4 hours away, depending on what you're looking at. And it's a lot to take in and then also help serve the people that you're working with.
Yeah, and evidence-based practice, this is another aspect of what I want to talk about, is it's so unique in rural communities that evidence-based practice does not always work. Like, I don't know if you drop me into an urban community if I would be a very good therapist, because in rural communities, you're much more of a relational therapist than you are in, I think, urban communities. From the therapists that I've talked to in those rural communities, the boundaries are very much more rigid than I have. Not saying like people know where I live or know, have met my family or anything, but I still have boundaries. It's just they're different. I may, like yesterday I had a client and we were talking about the golf tournament she was putting on, for her work. And we were talking about like, oh, who'd you get for sponsors, having more of that relational conversation. Whereas I probably would not do that in an urban community. But that also plays into evidence-based practices often don't work in rural communities because the culture is so different. Not to say they don't work in part, because I think they do, but when we're taught them in school, I don't think they touch on how they apply if you want to modify them or change them. The only training I've ever been to that they said, well, you can modify or change this how you want to do it is EMDR training. But that doesn't really take in the rural aspect. When you guys were learning about theories and evidence-based practice, did they touch on how to apply those to rural communities, or did you feel like you could?
I would say no. Me being someone who's primarily lived in urban communities, honestly, um,
Mm-hmm.
that's where I would probably put up kind of that. It would be unethical for me to go into a rural community and pretend that I could be a great practitioner without a lot more training, research into what that would be. So, I mean, while NMU, I think, did a really good job, kind of, what's the word for it? Like giving us the Spark Notes version of rural social work.
That's a good.
Yeah.
Um, I think that for me, never having the personal experience of being in a rural area, I would not feel like I would be the best person to do rural social work, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
I I think it's hard because I am in a rural community, what I consider a rural community. I
I
mean,
think growing up in a rural community and working in a rural community is a lot easier than if you grew up in an urban community and then go to school and work in a rural community. Because I don't know about you guys, but when I go to trainings, or maybe I not with my graduate program, but when I go to trainings or whatever, I'm like, okay, how can I apply this to the people I work with? When I was in grad school, I had no idea what I would really be doing outside of it because I didn't get to work with clients one-on-one. I didn't get to have that aspect of it. And so many interns do now. And so when I got out, I was like, well, I'm going to try this, I'm going to try that. I did a lot of different things. But I think growing up in one makes it easier when you're looking at trainings and you're learning things. Okay, how do I apply that to the people I work with?
I think the other thing that helped me was in my internship, there was a senior clinician, and obviously, like I said, I love relationships. So I ended up being a marriage counselor. And I really, really loved that. But I remember the couples class, and I was so excited. And it was really like, go get your Gottman level 1. And I was like, oh, that was not what I was expecting at all. I wanted a little bit more. But I remember getting that Gottman certification, and the senior clinician, I was like, okay, I don't necessarily agree with all of this in a rural area for this, and this reason. And he was like, okay, but you can adapt that, and you can take this and you can make it your own, and you can serve the community still using everything they've taught you. And I was just like, oh, I did not know I had that freedom. And that's one thing I think Myles and I have talked on our podcast sometimes, is that their graduate schools are trying to make you so ethical and so compliant that sometimes I think they rob you of your intuition, for lack of a better term. And I do feel like, I know we graduated in December, but I just feel like now, after being licensed for 6 months, that my intuition is coming back, because that's a powerful part, I think, in a rural community, especially. Like, I can be like, there's something off here. And maybe you wouldn't be able to confront somebody in a healthy way. I'm not talking about we throw down in the therapy room, but like, there's ways to confront your clients to make sure that you're like, okay, wait, am I missing something? Or was this was different from when we talked a couple weeks ago? And I think having that intuition is really important in a rural area. And so I wish that was maybe given back to us a little bit in graduate school. Like, trust yourself a little bit, because I feel like it's taken me about 3 to 6 months to get there again.
I think a lot
Postgraduate
of
school.
programs don't want you to trust yourself because they want you to be wary of diagnosing and doing those things. They want you to be very careful. And sometimes when people go full bore, right, they just are like, oh, maybe I shouldn't be doing that diagnosis. They don't know that. And so questioning yourself is part of that process of also growing to become the clinician you are. And I don't think they really communicate that piece, though, to you and why they're doing it. That's my personal opinion, but
And I think I got that in my internship in like group supervision or group discussions. But I mean, that was discussed between multiple students. I feel like, wouldn't you agree, Myles? Is like, it's almost to the point where you feel neurotic or paralyzed to an extent of like, I don't know which step to take. And like, I thought I had a good checks and balance system for, questioning myself and assessing all of this, but now I'm not even sure. And in a rural community, I think clients can sniff that out. And if you, I don't know if it's a moment of weakness or a moment of like, oh no, in a session that they see your face and they're like, something stinks. Like, what's going on here? And I think that can be damaging, and maybe sometimes where evidence-based practices can't always apply. But that's my 2 cents, and I'm a new baby therapist, so don't rely on me.
no, but that's what we're trying to figure out, right? Is what people come out of school with the knowledge to do. Go ahead, Myles.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think it's interesting that I think it was brought up a couple minutes ago where um, relational therapy is kind of the main part of rural social work or rural therapist, and that's not. I don't want to say advised by grad school, but that's just not the focus,
Right.
right? Like that's not. You're really focusing on theory and what theoretical approaches are best for certain diagnoses and all these things. And I consider myself a very relational therapist, which I've even found in just working with other practitioners here in the urban community, that can be frowned upon. So there is kind of
Oh
this
yeah, and people look at you like you're a little crazy.
yeah,
They're like,
it
"Why
is
would you
kind of
share
frowned
that?
upon.
Like, why would you disclose that?"
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
I always joke to my clients when they come in, I'm like, I wouldn't want to go see a therapist that I thought, well, they have no idea what I'm going through. They have never lived up, everything's gone right for them. Because that's what they're looking at us. They come in and they see us as these people who have our lives together. When in
Yeah.
reality, we probably don't, or we didn't at one time, because most people get into therapy because of the crap they went through
Hmm.
when they were younger. And I think a piece of that, if you know how to use the use of self correctly, can be very powerful when you're working with clients. But I don't know that urban providers can do it in a way that rural providers can do.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, with couples, like sometimes I just say, "All right, I'm going to share an example from my marriage." And I always say, "I have permission from my husband," just so we're clear, like that I've covered it on both ends. So they know I'm asking even my own husband. But sometimes it's just nice to know that somebody's been up the same creek in the same canoe with one paddle, like trying to figure this out.
Mhm.
And more than not, like I feel like there's themes maybe in rural areas that repeat, or diagnosis maybe, and that I'm not trying to stereotype or pigeonhole anybody, but we've grown up in the same area with the same blueprint, Urban has a lot more change and a lot more progression, and sometimes rural areas get stuck. And so I think that that relational piece of saying, yeah, I felt stuck there too when I was there, or, yep, you're right, I didn't know how to do this. And so this worked for me, it might not work for you, but here's an idea.
Yeah.
And also it keeps rapport with your clients. Sorry, Myles.
Oh
And
no, you're
in
good.
a rural community, that's so important. If you broke rapport, or if you lost if your client lost confidentiality in you, confidence. I'm going to get my words right, guys. If they lost confidence in you, see, we're human. We don't have our poop in a group. Um, if they lost confidence in you, that could damage
Mhm.
your reputation in a rural community, because news spreads like wildfire, guys.
Well, and like the other, a couple weeks ago when we had the fires and I had to let my clients know I canceled, I don't want them to think, oh, I'm just canceling just to cancel. So I said, I got to go. My family's property's in the fire. So we have to go and deal with that. And they're like, yeah, totally go. It also shortens the conversation when I'm talking to them on the phone or trying to do something and get them canceled. But I think people appreciate that. I appreciate that when I talk to my own therapist is, some of that lived and shared experience of knowing that we all went through crap. We all have stuff. I think where I struggle sometimes is when I see things in like the newspaper. And then it carries like if I see somebody got divorced or if I see somebody went to jail and I know that they're related to the person or they are part of the couple that, I might see the spouse. It that is kind of like I think where I struggle with like not bringing it up in session. I'm like, so which maybe that's not the right choice. And I don't always, but usually I don't even have to bring it up. It's usually brought up before I have a chance. But that piece of it too is like you're going to see this in the paper. You're going to see that. Whereas in an urban community, you're not going to see that as much because there's so many different things at play.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I'm sure this is probably a very different experience than because I'm in such an urban area. I've never seen one of my clients in the local area. I honestly never had any read anything about them, seen
What's that
anything.
like?
I'm sure very different. My whole experience of being a therapist has been that way, so I don't know anything different.
Do you have conversations with your clients of like, if I see you in public, this is what happens still?
Yeah, yeah, I
Okay.
do. I know, I mean, my mom's a therapist here. She's run into her clients before. So it does happen. I think it depends on kind of where you're at. You know, like I live in Merritt, like in a different community than where I work. So like
Mhm.
maybe, if my clients
I think that
are,
does help a lot because I have a friend who lives in Lewis and works in Moscow, and it's a 30-minute commute. And when I worked in Moscow and lived down here, I never hardly ran into people from Moscow location because they were just never here. But I can probably run into somebody every time I go to Walmart.
I've had clients be like, "Oh, I saw a sparkle of an earring somewhere. That's my therapist." And I'm like, "Okay."
I think the hardest place that I run into people though is like at my kids' school events when they have kids, my kids' age, and then they're at a soccer game or they're in marching band or whatever, and then navigating that, and that's a conversation that I had to learn to have. And I think those are the things that I would like seeing more in education is teaching you how to have those conversations and how to deal with those situations, some of those ethical gray areas that exist in rural communities that aren't addressed in education. What are kind of to wrap all of it up, I wanted to figure out like do you guys have any suggestions or things that would have made their program, because they do include a rural part, or even programs that don't, to help you be more prepared when you graduated?
So you mentioned that NNU has a competency specifically to rural communities. And do you dive into that in other podcasts, Dr. Charles?
What specifically?
Like what that means for a graduate student?
No.
Okay, so for those of you listening, that competency is stated. It's something that we have to learn on. You write objectives or learning goals off of it. And then during your internship, which is how many hours did we have to do, Myles? Is it
You have to do
500 or
600.
Yep, so 600 hours of all of us learning. That is what we strive to achieve or learn too. It's different for everybody. Myles got to do amazing things with that learning objective. Like, I believe you went to like the Senate, right? And watched stuff, if I remember right.
yeah, there was a lot more, I guess, I remember when we were comparing our learning plans and you were like, you did what? I read this article. Very different.
But they were also very lenient on it as well. And I remember going back to my field liaison, I think was her title, and I was like, I need to adjust this goal because it is not getting accomplished. So that was a learning curve and helping me pick what was practical and realistic in our rural area. So that, I do believe the competency that they had helped me learn about rural areas. But I do think that that class on rural social work could have probably been expanded a little bit and helped us. Also, like practicing a hard conversation, like you've said, like you've ran into clients. And so Myles might actually have 7 degrees of separation. I have 2 or 3. Conflicts of interest, dual relationships, those are all really prominent in a small area. And I've had clients that have come in and know me by my maiden name, and I'm like, maybe it was one of those therapists that needed to get their life together and that when they were younger, and I'm like, oh, I don't know if we're going to be a good fit because I don't know if I can function with if you knew me as my maiden name. Or when they're like, are you related to so-and-so? And I'm like, yep. What's your relationship with them? Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to refer you out.
My favorite is though that when they sneak up on you and you don't know it and you've seen him for 6 months and then you realize there's a connection. Because I was seeing this lady for 6 months and then I figured out, oh my gosh, she's the parent of somebody I knew pretty good in high school. And I know a lot of stuff about her home life in high school that I probably shouldn't be doing in this. And so thankfully we were at the end of therapy at that point, but I was like, I can't see you anymore now that I know that. but they sneak up on you.
I
Right.
think
And
that's
I
one. I
go
was
ahead,
gonna say, I
Myles.
think that's one thing that maybe they did talk about in grad school. It's, to be completely honest, there were so many things that I might just not remember. Um, but
It's
the
a gray
difference,
area.
it is. My brain was a gray area last year. Um, I wonder, like, if we talked about the ethical considerations and how different it is, because in my practice in the last like 7 months now, I've had very little ethical dilemmas, ethical like things where I was like, what do I do about this? I need to talk to my supervisor. Um, it just hasn't come up, right? Because I haven't met a client who maybe there's a dual relationship with, or um, someone that knows me or I know them somehow. That just hasn't happened, which I think for you, Alina, or just like working in rural areas in general, there's a lot more ethical considerations. Like, okay, but if you're one of the only providers, at what point do we have to like really figure out how we're still going to get these clients services? Because if every provider in a rural community says, sorry, can't see you because we all know each other somehow, then there's that huge lack of resources. So there's a lot more ethical considerations, I would say, in rural social work.
Yeah, and I think I wish excuse me, we had learned how to either approach or navigate. I mean, probably both. But how do I determine if this is going to do more damage? Like, I needed a decision-making model for dual relationships specifically. And Dr. Charles is making a face over there. But it's true.
There isn't one. That was one thing in my research. That was a big argument, is that there's no decision making model for rural communities, and so people hodgepodge it together and put it together, and then hope for the best.
Yeah, there's not a flow chart that says, okay, yes, I can see you because of this, but not because of that. Or, how do you, like, and you're right, they do sneak up on you, like in an intake, and they start to talk about something, and I'm like, I feel like I've heard a version of this story.
Mm-hmm.
And then you kind of have to be like, so I'm going to ask a pointed question really quickly. I need to know this, and this. And then you kind of have to be like, okay. Also, like, when you work at an agency, what do you do when you know people, right? Myles, has that ever happened to you? Has anybody you've ever known come to one of your agencies that you've worked at?
He has to think about it, so probably
Only
not.
the only way that's happened is if it was like a client from a previous job, like that I knew from a provider client relationship, and then I switched
Right.
jobs, and now they're at the new now they've come for services at the new place, but never on a personal level. No.
Yeah. Like my brother's girlfriend was like, I'd love to find a therapist. I'm like, well, you can't come to my office. You can't come anywhere near me. And then also you're like, I don't know who I would refer you to that I don't have a relationship with, or, another agency in the area. And I'm like, I wish that piece was covered a little bit more. And then just how to interact. Like, I do have that conversation with clients, like, degrees of separation are 2 or 3. If I see you in Costco and you wave and I see you, I'll probably wave back, but you got to know that my family knows exactly what I do and they're going to ask questions. Here's how I'm going to handle it. But also, please don't be offended, because I try to zone out when we're in public because it's such a small community and I don't want to be approached. I want my time protected, and how to do that as well.
Because they'll get their feelings hurt if you don't. Some of them get their feelings hurt if you don't want to say hello to them in public. They're like, oh, you don't like me. And like me personally, I am the least observant person when I'm in public, because I just shut it down. And like, I ran into my husband and walked right by him before in a restaurant, and then he scares the crap out of me. So I'm really not that observant. And so when I'm out in public, I tell people that too. When I go in session, when we're doing sessions, I'm like, if I don't see you, it's not because I'm ignoring you. It's I don't see you. So if you really want to say hello to me, you're welcome to, but same conversation as Elena. It's less so now that my kids are grown and they are not little. When they were little, they used to, if somebody came up to me, they'd be like, "Are you a client?" Every single time. If they did, they assumed if they had never met them, that they must be somebody I see.
And
They-
my daughter's at that age. Yeah.
Yeah.
My mommy has clients.
Mhm.
Do you go to my mommy's office?
Yeah.
Shush, child. And I just have to say, I'm sorry. Yep. This is what 4 is like. So I wish that piece was covered a little bit more, because there's just, it seems almost treacherous sometimes to have this license in a rural area, because it does sometimes feel like one wrong step can really mess with your career.
Well, and it
And
can. I mean, I've done supervision for people who have been reported to the board because they didn't take the necessary steps. And most of those steps, like what I talk about in other podcasts, is supervision, supervision, supervision. If you are in doubt of whether you should see a person, always consult with at least 2 people. Because then you can say, when the board comes calling, "Hey, I consulted and I did this, this, and this," and always document it, because if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And so always covering your butt in that situation, because somebody can get in the situation that I'm doing a supervision with somebody in a rural community who's not even around where we live, but it is a rural community, is that they ended up having a personal kind of vendetta against the provider and was like just reporting for every little thing. And so people can get mad and report you to the board. And that can be scary.
yeah, and it is a fear. There was an agency in the valley that hired somebody that other people in the valley didn't think were reputable, and they put that agency and that person on blast on social media, and it blew up.
Oh, I've talked about that in another podcast. They know it's me.
Oh, okay. Well, I wasn't going to disclose that it was your agency, but wait for you to be honest. But it was
No, we've already talked about it.
Great. Then it was hard. Like, and
Mhm.
people would come up to me afterwards and be like, "I am so sorry that your agency went through that, but did you know also?" And I'm like, Stop. I don't like to post on Facebook. I don't use my Instagram. Like, stop. There's a reason I live under a hole.
Yeah. And we did live under a home. We got very caught off guard because it's a small community, and everybody's like, "Well, you should have known that." Well, I don't read the news. I don't do a lot on social media except for work. And so
It's not going to come up on a background check when you apply
Yeah.
for a job. Like,
Yeah.
I'm so sorry that, and it was a huge deal. And so things like that kind of make you feel paralyzed in a rural area, because you're like,
so much of you wants to say something and you have to keep your mouth shut.
that too.
You know, that was the hardest thing for me, is I wanted to rebuttal. I wanted to make a public statement of, we made a very passive statement of just restating our mission and kind of what our intent is. And that's all very broad and just was a general thing, but that's all we could do.
Yeah. So, I wish that was expanded on. It was just, maybe, like, I understand accuracy and stuff, but just the fear that comes with working sometimes in a rural community and how to handle it. And yes, you're right. Supervision is the answer. Talking again, I love relationships, so
The answer is always supervision.
draw on people.
Yeah, I would say just kind of wrapping everything we talked about. I feel like our university, like while they did have the rural social work component, and there's nothing against the university, we got a little bit extra lucky just having our one specific professor there, Elena, you know who I'm talking about, who lived in their community. Like,
Yeah.
what was there, like less than 100 people?
I want to say, like, maybe there's 50 people in that town.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And so we got to hear her experience, right? And what it was like being a social worker in that town. And, just
It
all of
was
that.
very helpful.
And on the flip side of that, I don't think it's not required. It should be required, and it's not yet required to learn these things before you become. especially if you're working in states where like you're gonna do telehealth, right? Like if I'm a telehealth provider, because I do see some clients telehealth, they don't all live in urban
No,
cities
and
like I
they
do.
have to know what they're doing too.
Yeah, and so right now it's kind of just on the provider, like it's on me to further my research and further my education about rural communities. When I think it could be helpful to have, even like board requirements for CEUs, like every year that you have to understand some of these things if you're going to work in a state like Idaho, where most of the state is rural versus
And I
my
think NNU
definition
has
of
the
rural.
right idea of adding it to maybe the CSWE competencies. I think that's a good idea.
Mm,
I don't know if that'll ever actually pick up, but I think it would be a good idea at least to touch on it at some point in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you guys want to add before we end today?
Well, obviously, thank you for having us and allowing us to promote our podcast as well.
Yeah, and I will have a link to subscribe in the description for people to subscribe to your guys' podcast. So you can guys,
Just a
listeners, can do that.
forewarning, we really have not done it since grad school, but our plan is to start it back up. So
Well, then
Yep.
you always need people to link to it if they like it.
Yeah.
We do. We just had to take a pause and regain some of ourselves a little bit.
Understandable. Well, thank you
Thank
for
you
joining
again.
me today. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.